Hello, this is my Q1 2026 financial recap. In this video, I'm going to be going over everything that we earned, spent, compare that progress against our 2026 financial plan, and then take a look at my net worth and goals to see whether or not we're on track. I make videos here all the time where I budget out my paychecks and track my financial journey as a high income earner in a high cost of living area. So why don't we go ahead and get started with income? The total income that we took home at the end of Q1 was $49,134.23. Of that, $13,000 came from my partner's contribution to our overall lifestyle expenses, $5.44 in other income that we earned from the interest on our building security deposit, $25,000 from my paychecks, about $500 worth of interest, and about $10,000 from a stock vest that happened in February. So that was what we were working with as far as what we took home. It'll be interesting to see that up against what we actually ended up spending. I'll start by taking a look at some of the high-level category spending that we did so far this year. And you can see our total spending so far is $66,349.01. That is about $16,000 over what we earned. And we'll talk about how I deal with that overspending in a later part of the video. Japan was our highest spend category for the year so far. We spent $24,102. That's about 36% of our total spending on a little holiday. That was my first ever trip to Japan. I don't know exactly what I was expecting. I feel like I was just amazed at every single turn. As soon as we landed and did some exploring, my partner was like, "Oh my gosh, this is like a utopia." Obviously, that's not true of any society, but I think we were just blown away by like the cleanliness, the courtesy that we were shown, and just like the beauty of all the different sites we were taking in, from wandering the streets of different areas of Tokyo to looking at cherry blossoms in Kyoto. We actually also stayed at a ryokan, which is a traditional Japanese hotel that's usually owned by a family for like hundreds of years. And we got to stay at one that was also an onsen. So I did get to have an onsen experience, and that was like 10 out of 10. So I definitely know I want to go back to Japan. This was a really pricey trip because we did end up booking last minute, and this is Sakura season. So it was over what I was initially thinking I was going to spend on a spring vacation, but I think it was well worth it. And so that is our big trip for the year. So that's it. Rent was about 15% of our overall spend. I spent $6,000 on student loans, which amounted to about 9%. Meal kit was our next biggest at 5% at about $3,500. That's with the meal kit company we started the year out with, but we did end up canceling and made a change, so I can talk more about that in my upcoming budgeting video. Takeout and delivery was around the same as meal kits at about that 5% mark. And then Wildflower Farms, this was another little trip that we took this spring. We ended up spending about $2,600 while we were there, doing activities, eating, getting spa treatments, all of that stuff. And then household goods, $2,000. And then about $2,000 each on household goods and my auto loan. The rest of these are pretty nominal, so I'm not going to bother going through them. But our average daily spend for this quarter was $737.21. And takeout and delivery was our most frequent category for transactions. We had 78. And then, our largest outflow was one of the hotels that we booked for our Japan trip. Now that I've taken a look at my spending from about a 40,000 foot view, I'm going to actually go back to income and expense and compare the spending that we did this quarter against my planned spending for the year. At the start of 2026, I did something that I do every single year to project and plan for the year ahead, and that was to create a conscious spending plan. This groups my budget categories into fixed costs, investment, savings goals, and guilt-free spending. Each one has a target to aim for, which lets me know if I'm more or less on track in creating an overall healthy financial picture. To compare against the targets that I set for myself at the start of the year, I'm going to enter the Q1 numbers and just see where we stand. So first we have partner contributions here. The average I anticipated for the year was $2,600. But for Q1, because we did have lots of travel spending, this number is going to be artificially inflated at $4,445. I estimated that my paychecks would be about $9,000. Right now, we are at an average of about $8,500, so not too far off. For interest, I anticipated about $100 a month, and on average, we're at $166. So a little bit higher than what I expected there, but a pretty nominal difference overall. And then for the stock vests, I anticipated $6,500 on average, and right now we're at $3,285. So I will add that. So my net income for Q1 is a little bit lower than what I anticipate for the entire year at $18,200. And so I'm curious to see what that's going to do to fixed costs and the other numbers that I have here. All right, I'm going to select all my categories now, and we can go through and compare the average for Q1 to what I have in my CSP. Okay, so the first thing in my fixed cost is rent at $34.75. That is still consistent there. Storage is $50 a month, so that's also the same. And then my garage is $260. Building utilities were slightly higher than the $70 I projected at $74. Utilities are at $403, which is higher than the $300 I projected just because we're in the winter months, so that's to be expected. Wi-Fi $129. That reminds me I need to call them because they increased the price of our service and I need to figure out why that is. And then renter's insurance, I did not do any spending from. I just set aside $13 a month in order to save for that when it's due. Cleaning service, because we didn't get cleanings every 2 weeks, we skipped some weeks. It looks like in February and March, we only got our apartment cleaned once. So that's a little bit lower than the $300 I projected at $198. I'll just make that $199. Household goods is, wow, we're trending lower than 2025. In 2025, we averaged $800 a month. Right now, we're just a little bit under $7 at $697. So moving in the right direction for sure there. All right, so that's all the fixed costs in the home category group. I'll go down to food and drink now. And we will start with meal kit. I estimated an average of $1,200 a month. It looks like we're right there at $1,165. And this is again for Q1. I expect this to come down if we use the new meal kit that we've signed up for the rest of the year. And so this should be quite a bit lower if that ends up being the case. But this is where we are right now. Groceries is a little bit higher, almost double actually, at $540 instead of $300. So something to keep my eye on. Meals at work is $318 on average. So that is also trending higher than what was planned. And then planes, trains, and automobiles, I like to average this whole group because I do pay my car payment every single month and charging, but some of the other expenses like auto insurance only come out once every 6 months. So they're a little bit infrequent, but I still want to account for them in the total cost of ownership there. So I projected $1,100 and it looks like we're at $995, so just a little bit under. Then personal care. I've stuck with a target in my budget of $150, but consistently I'm seeing that I'm spending over that. So the average for the first quarter is $382 or $383 if we round up. So that might also be something to keep my eye on. Subscriptions are a little bit lower at $147. I think that's artificially low because my parents put us all on like an Apple family plan. And so now some of my charges for my prior Apple subscriptions are being charged to my parents. So I probably should actually pay them back for that. But we're slightly under with that change. Annual fees, we have spent how much? $32 so far. And debt payments on average, we're at $2,300. In the plan, I have $3,300 because I will be throwing some additional money toward my student loans. So fixed cost total is $11,725 versus the $12,500 that I thought we would spend. But because our income is a little bit lower than the average projected, we are 3 percentage points higher at 72% on fixed costs, which does feel a little bit high. For investments, I have been investing just about $500 a month of my own money plus the match that I get from my employer. So that is right on target. And you won't see that in YNAB because YNAB doesn't really track investments very well. And then we'll go to savings goals. So I think I'm going to do a little mishmash here in how I track this. So savings goals are categories that I set aside money for every single month. Some of them I'll spend from sporadically, like with out of pocket. That's for any healthcare costs that I incur throughout the year, like therapy, prescriptions, dental, vision, all of that stuff. Whereas festivities are once a year for like the holiday season, or gifts for others come up for birthdays and, you know, Mother's Day, Father's Day. So I'm going to like blend this a little bit. So for out of pocket, I've been setting aside $250 a month, but I actually have spent on average $316 between therapy and prescriptions so far this year. That's a little higher than the amount I set aside. So I just want to like record that difference. For festivities, I set aside $125, but I didn't spend it. Gifts for others, I set aside $100, haven't spent that yet. And mutual aid, I also have not spent at $10 a month. I'm also working on setting aside 3 months of expenses, so that should be $1,500 a month. But I have not done that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm just going to leave that at 0 for now. And we can see we're at 3% for savings goals, which is quite a bit lower than what I was aiming for. Lastly, we have guilt-free spending. So there's a couple different categories here that I like to allocate money for, and then the rest theoretically should be left over for whatever I want to do. Here we have takeout and delivery. Let's find that on the budget. That is at about $1,200, or we can be a little more precise, I suppose. $1,164. Coffee is at $68. And then let's scroll down to fitness and find that one. That's an average of $35. Hobbies, $35 as well. And then travel, this one always seems to throw me. Our average is $8,990, which is much higher than the 12-month average I anticipated spending for travel. It's artificially inflated because we did some big trips as the year goes on, and we're no longer taking those massive trips. The average of this should decrease month over month over month. So overall, fixed costs are right about on track with a few fluctuations from the plan, where a couple of categories are under by $100, a couple are over. So numerically, we're sitting below what I projected month over month here, which is good. And I hope that I can continue in that direction, trending towards spending just slightly less on fixed costs by lowering things like household goods, meal kit, groceries, and meals at work. Maybe also personal care. We'll see. Investments are fine. Savings goals need to definitely take some action here on the 3-month expenses and keep an eye on out-of-pocket spending coming up for the next quarter. And guilt-free spending should be fine, getting that travel in check for the rest of the year. Now we'll take a look at my net worth, and we will start with the cash accounts. So at the start of the quarter, I had $50,094.75 in cash. That did go up slightly in February with that stock vest to $58,000, but in March we're back down a little bit to $55,000. Overall, though, pretty steady. This does not account for 3 months of expenses. This is basically just our current month expenses, next month expenses, and some sinking funds. Even though this may look like a lot of cash based on our spending, there's a lot more that I need to have set aside, probably almost double this. Now let's look at retirement. At the start of the quarter, I had $316,471 invested for retirement. That went up by about $2,500 in February to $319,000, and now we're back down to $304,000 at the end of March with the recent turmoil in the market due to the conflicts that are happening globally. But that's totally outside of my control. I'm just going to keep investing, but so far we see a change of about a 4% decrease in those investments so far. The last asset that I have is my car, which I also keep track of in my net worth. I know there's lots of different opinions about whether or not you should include assets like cars here. I do for now. And I also set the value for the car at the start of the year. So every January 1st, I will look at the value of my car, factoring in depreciation. And so for this year, that price is sitting steady at $18,750. Okay, now let's take a look at my debts. So first we have credit card balances. At the start of the year, my balances across all my cards was $15,295. It went up in February to $32,137. And that is in large part due to booking a lot of our trip. And then in March, we bumped up slightly more to $35,199 after having actually done the travel. Overall, my credit card balances increased by about $20,000. And these are just the balances as of the date at the end of the month. I pay the statement balance every single month. I never carry any credit card debt month to month. And I also have enough in cash to be able to pay this off entirely and still pay for all my expenses with cash in the month. But I wanted to just show what those balances look like as we made some larger purchases. Okay, and then now let's look at my auto loan. My auto loan started at $11,151.50 in January. And now it has decreased by about 10.4% to $9,996.72. And then lastly, my big one, my student loan. The balance started out at negative $237,630.67. And over 2 months, it decreased by about $1,700. So you can see over half of what I'm paying is going to interest. So my balance at the end of March was $235,926.16. So looking at my overall net worth, I started out the year at about $121,000, and I slipped just below six figures to $96,786.39, largely due to higher spending and those increased balances on my credit cards in the market dip. But what can you do? Chalk it up to the game. That is a change in net worth of negative 20.2%. So we'll see what happens here in the next quarter. All right, lastly, I want to talk about my 2026 goals and the progress on those. I made two goals for the year. One was to send $36,000 to my student loan, and the other was to add $18,000 to my 3-month expense fund. And I started out the year with $18,000 in my 3-month expense fund. We'll take a look at where we are. At the end of Q1 for my student loan, I am 5% of the way toward my goal, having assigned $2,000 to that loan so far. And you might be like, what? That's like 3 months into the year. How have you only assigned $2,000? Well, the monthly payments that I made in January and February were paid for with 2025's income that I had set aside. So the first income of 2026 that actually went toward my student loans, toward this $36,000, is this $2,000, even though I've paid $6,000 so far. Hopefully that makes sense. And then for the 3-month expenses, I'm going to have to do a hard reset because I did end up draining the money that I had there in order to fund all the travel that we did. Looking at our overall spending for the quarter, we were about $16,000 or $17,000 above what we took home. And so the difference had to be made up somewhere, and this is where it came from. I understand that's not ideal. Not this month, April, but next month in May, I'm going to do a hard reset of this goal and go from there to try to get back on track for the rest of the year and hopefully not pull from this again. But yeah, that is it. Q1 is over. We are mostly on track. I've made a few changes going into the next quarter, like changing my meal plan, tracking very closely my household goods spending to hopefully lower a little bit of that. I will not be going on more large vacations for the rest of the year. But otherwise, I think that the plan that I put in place in my CSP makes sense, and I plan on following that for the rest of the year. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Tell me how your Q1 has been treating you financially, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.